In this example, we're going to show you how we can create turn shapes and spun shapes using the turn and spin function in the software. Let's go to File, Close, and then we're going to open an existing file. From the Turn and Spin Guide project folder, we're going to open the Turn and Spin Guide 3D modeling file. And here, if we go to my layer manager at the top there, you'll see that we have no layers visible, and within all of these layers we've got sets of simple vectors that we've drawn up in the software, and we're going to use these to demonstrate the turn and spin tool. So let's just switch on the turn shape 1 layer. We'll see that this is a bottle, and then we could just click into the white space. Now before we go into the turn and spin tool, let's look at tiling our windows vertically. Come up to this icon over here, that way I can see the 2D view on the left and I can see the 3D view on the right hand side. Now to access the turn and spin tool, we need to go into the modeling tab, and within the modeling tools it's the 4th icon along, and you'll see here we've got create shape by spinning or turning a vector. And let's just click in there to open the turn and spin tool. So this form allows us to create two types of shapes. We can create turn shapes and we can create spun shapes. So let's have a look at the turn tool to begin with. Now the turn tool allows us to create rounded symmetrical shapes where we take one cross section and one cross section only, and we turn it from the start point about a line to the end point. So let's have a look at how this works. So we're going to look at using this vector here. Now when you use the turn option, you need a cross section that represents the silhouette of half or the side of the shape that you want to create. So for example, we can see here we've got a shape that represents half of a bottle, as if we were to just cut through the middle of a bottle. This is the side profile that we'd have left over. Now if we take that profile, and if I just press N on the keyboard, we can access node edit mode. So I can see the start point is here, and I can see the end point is directly below it down here. And so what the turn tool does, it basically takes this vector that we've got here, and it's going to rotate it about a line running from the start point to the end point here. So it's going to create the full shape of the wine bottle like a mirrored version, and it's going to fill it with a rounded shape. So now we can think about turning this shape. So let's use the turn option here. Then we could choose how we combine this component that we're going to create with any other components that we may already have in our job. In this case, we're just going to leave this set to add. Then we could name our component appropriate to what it is that we're creating. So I'm going to call this one bottle. And then we could simply use the apply option, and that's going to create a rounded symmetrical shape based on the cross section that we used here, where we've turned it from its start point around a line going to its end point, and we can see the result of that turn here in the 3D view. Now if we take a look up the y-axis, we can see that nice rounded shape running through the entire component there. So let's just put this in Z. So then we can close the form down. We can see that I have the component in the component tree. I have a grayscale representation of that component, and we can see that there in the 3D view. Now if I wanted to, I could put it into transform mode by clicking on that again. I could move it, I could size it, I could shrink it down. Could look at rotating this. And so as soon as we've closed the turn and spin form down, there is no connection between that model and the vector that we used to create that component. So let's just delete that component there. I'm going to go back into the turn and spin form. Now this time we're going to go to our layer manager. We're going to switch off turn shape 1. We're going to switch on turn shape 2, which is the pepper mill. So this is a vector that I've drew up in the software, and this represents half of a pepper mill. So let's look at turning this shape to create the full pepper mill. So let's select that vector, make sure turn is selected, choose a combine mode. We'll just go with add in this case. You could give this a name if we wanted to, so we'll call this one pepper mill, and then we could go ahead and press apply. Okay, so we can see that we've got a shape created where we've turned it about that imaginary line from the start point to the end point. Let's fill it with a rounded shape that we can see there. So let's just put that back in Z. Now the way that the software creates the height for the component in the turn option is purely based on the width of the vector. So remember, we have this imaginary line that runs from start point to end point. So where the vector is closer to that line, we're going to get less height. So if I run my cursor over this point here, you can see highlighted there, it's just under 0.3. And then where the vector comes further apart, like here from this imaginary line that runs through roughly around here, and if I hover over the actual component, you can see we're creating more height. That's at around 1.2. So the closer it is to that line, the less height we have, the further apart, the more height we have. For example, if you look at this central area here, and then hover my mouse over this point here, you can see it's at just under 0.8. And we can see at the highest point of this component is roughly around here at 0.135, and that's because this area of our vector is furthest away from that line that we rotate between the start and the end point. Now we do have the option here to scale our component to an exact height, and that will scale the highest point of your component to a value that you input in this form here. So if we just check that option, okay, so we can see it's at 1 there, and you may have noticed that our component has changed slightly. Okay, it doesn't have its full roundness anymore, and if I hover over this area here, we can see that the highest point there is at the 1 inch. We could look at reducing that. Let's make that 1/2 inch, press apply, and you can see we're just really flattening and squashing the shape there. And if we wanted to go the other direction, we can make it 2 inches high, press apply. Again, you'll see we've got a very high shape there, and the highest point of this component is now at 2 inches. So let's just uncheck that. I liked how it looked before, where it was scaled out proportionally, so we've got the nice rounded shape in there. We'll put that in Z, and you'll see here we have the option to reset the shape, and this is good if we were wanting to change from creating this pepper mill to turning or spinning a different vector. So let's just reset that shape. And then we're going to come over to our layer manager, turn this off. I'm going to turn on turn shape 3, which is the spindle layer. I'll just click in the white space there. So here I have a vector that I've drew up that represents a spindle. So let's have a look at turning that shape. So we're going to select that vector, use the turn option, give that a name. We're going to call this one spindle, and we could go ahead and press apply. Now the shape that we've got here isn't quite what I was looking for. So let's just have a look at our vector in node edit mode. So let's just select it, press N on the keyboard. Now we know that when we turn a shape, we turn it around a line going from the start and the end point. Start point is here, the end point is here. They're in line with each other. We've got a flat shape coming out, and then we've got the shape of the decorative area of the spindle. Now I can see now why we're getting this shape. So it's spinning it about a line that goes from here to here, and so it's spun it in this direction. Now, ideally what I wanted to happen was for this to spin round the sort of horizontal line. And so for me to actually accomplish this, I need to add in some legs into my cross section. And these legs will form the height of my spindle in order for me to turn that about an imaginary line that will run somewhere around here. So let's just reset that, and we're just going to come out of that form there. Let's go into the drawing tab, and we're going to look at drawing those legs. So we're going to use the polyline tool. I'm going to make use of the geometry and smart snapping here to help me find the job's horizontal center line. So you can see that I can see that there. So I want the leg to end along this line here. So I'm going to snap to the end point of my cross section like so. And I'm just going to drag my cursor down until we find that horizontal line. So that's the center of my job there. I'm just going to click to snap to that point. Then we're going to press the space bar to finish that line. Come over here and we're going to snap to the end point there. Run that cursor down until we meet up with that center horizontal line there, and I can click in place, right click to come out of the polyline tool. You'll see now I have 3 separate vectors. So we need to join those. So with that vector selected, we're going to hold down Shift and select the other 2 vectors. We're going to come over and we're going to join these vectors. So at that tolerance, we're going to have one open vector after we've joined them. So let's join them and then close that down. You'll see now we have one open vector, and this is looking more like the part that I wanted to turn earlier. And so we're going to look at turning this about the start point and end point, which is, if we press node edit mode, we can see the start point is here, end point is here. So this is going to be the imaginary horizontal line in which we're going to rotate this shape around. So let's just go into normal selection mode, into the modeling tab, and we'll look at turning that shape. So we'll go into turn and spin. With that vector selected, we're going to use the turn option, and we could just go ahead and press apply. And there we can see the shape of the spindle here, and this is what I was expecting earlier. We can see that rounded shape running through the entire part of my component there. And so as a guide, the vector cross section that you draw should always represent half of the silhouette that you actually want to turn. So let's just reset this, and we're going to look at one more example of turning a shape. So let's come over to our layer manager, switch that off, switch on turn shape 4, which is the pendant. So this is a vector that I've drew up that represents half the shape of a pendant that I'd like to turn. So let's take this vector, use the turn option, go ahead and press apply. Let's take a look at that in the 3D view. If we just zoom in on that shape, you can see we've got some nice shapes coming through there. Now when we get to this section here, if we just zoom in, we can see it's almost as if this section is hanging from the section above and below by what appears to be 1 pixel. And so this isn't really going to give me a reasonably strong shape for me to cut. So let's see what's happened there. If we just put that in Z, so if we go into the 2D view and just zoom in on that particular area. Now we know that when we turn our cross section, we turn it about a line running from start point all the way through to the end point. And so if we imagined that line, we can see what's happening here. Now our cross section is coming round and it's actually cutting past our imaginary line in the x-axis, and then it's coming back round and then it goes back over. And so everything above this point here is rotating from left to right. As it gets to this point here, it's rotating from right to left, and then as it comes back round, it's rotating left to right. And so that's why we're seeing that very small pixel there. Now, if I wanted to edit the shape of this, just so it gives it a little bit more substance, I could do by simply selecting that vector, going into Node Edit mode. And here we could tweak this vector, whereby we could use this grayscale component as a guide. So here I'm just going to right click, we're going to insert a point there, I'm going to right click and insert a point here. And I'm going to take that node and we're just going to move that out a little. If I wanted to, I could pull the handle up and bring that down like so. So you can see we're just still roughly following the shape we've got there, but now when I go ahead and press apply, you can see it's a lot thicker, more usable. So let's just close this form down. You can see my component here. Just use the option here to zoom to fit in the 2D view. Right then, so let's just take that component and we're just going to delete that, and then we're going to go to our layer manager, turn that layer off, and now we're going to look at how spinning a shape works. So let's select the spun shape one, which is the plate, and we'll just click into the white space and we'll go back into the create shape by spinning or turning a vector. And so to spin a shape we use this second option here. And spinning a shape allows us to take a single cross section and spin it around the cross section's left end point to create a circular shape with the profile of your cross section. So let's have a look at this vector as an example. So I'm going to take this vector here, we're going to use the spin option. As I said, we spin that around the left endpoint, so it's going to take the left hand side of the vector and it's going to find that endpoint on the left hand side and it will spin it about that point, and it will spin it in a circular motion to allow us to create a circular component with the profile of this cross section that we have here. So here we can choose a combine mode, and then we could give that a name. I'm going to call this one plate. Then we could go ahead and press apply. And so we can see it's created that circular shape based on this vector being spun around that left endpoint. So we can see we've got a flat shape here, and we can see that flat shape in the centre of our circle, and then where it raises up, if we just put that in ISO view, you can see we've got that lip around the outside or the border of this plate, and that's all down to this area of the vector here. And so we can see how this vector has spun around to ultimately create this plate shape. And so the size of the actual circle that you create is all down to the width of the vector that you're spinning. As this vector, or this cross section, this ultimately forms the radius for the part that you're going to create. So now we could go ahead and close that form down. See that I have a component here called plate. We've got the grayscale representation of that component, and we can see that there in the 3D view. And if I wanted to, I could take that plate, I could size it, I could just change it, I could look at rotating it. And as we said earlier, once we've applied the shape and come out of the form, our component has no connection with the vector that we used to create that shape. So let's right click on the plate component. We're going to use the option here to delete it. So let's go to the layer manager. I'm going to switch off that layer, switch on spun shape 2, which is the ripple, make that the active layer, and then let's go back into the spin and turn tool. We'll just put this in the z-axis. So here we have a vector that I've drew up in the software, which would give me a ripple effect circular shape. So let's select that vector, I'm going to spin that, give that a name, we'll call this one ripple, and then we could simply go ahead and press apply. And so you'll see that due to the position of my vector that we're spinning, the part doesn't actually fit within the bounds of my job space. And so it wouldn't give me that full circular shape that I was looking for. And that's because when we spin a vector, we always spin it around the left endpoint of the vector, which is this point here. And so if we applied this now and then we just close that form down, you see we've got our component there, and then if we just take this component and we move it, you see that we're left with an incomplete shape that has a straight edge from the job bounds, because the shape that we were spinning was positioned in a way that we couldn't actually fit the complete circle in the bounds of our job space. And so it's important to remember here that the software will spin this about the left side of the cross section. So just make sure that your job space is big enough, or that you have your vector positioned in a way that the software can create the full circle for you. So let's just right click on that component. I'm going to use the option here to delete it. Now let's have a look at actually positioning this vector so that we can fit the entire circle in our job space. So I'm just going to select it again to put it into transform mode. I'm just going to pick it up by holding down and snapping to the end point there. I'm going to try and snap to the center of my job vertically and horizontally. So you can see I've picked up the vertical and horizontal lines for my job, and I can click in place there so I know it's in the center there. And so I know that this should essentially fit within the bounds of my job space. So if that vector's selected, let's go over to the turn and spin option. I'm going to spin that, let's apply that, and we can see now that we've got the full circle that I was looking for. And so we know that the size of the circle is all down to the actual width of the vector that you're spinning, which acts as the radius for the part. And so we've repositioned that, knowing that the left side is positioned in the center of our job. We can clearly see that we're going to get a circle that will fit within our job bounds. Now the height of the shape is controlled by the cross section also. So if we have a look at the height of the vector, we can see it's highlighted there at the bottom. You can see we've got a height of 0.4001. And so the way that I've drew this vector, all of these peaks line up with the center area here, which is the highest point. So if I run my cursor over this point here, you'll see highlighted at the bottom, we've got a Z value showing 0.4001. Now we have a way to control the height if we wanted to, where we could use the scale to an exact height. So if we check that option, and let's just reduce that, let's say we'll make that 0.75 and then press apply. And so what happens now, the highest point of my component will now be 0.75. So if I run my cursor over that point, you'll see highlighted at the bottom there, it's showing a Z value of 0.75, and then everything else is scaled from that height. In this case, I just want to undraw that option, put it back to how we had it scaled to the actual vector that we're using. So let's just reset this shape. I'm going to go to our layer manager, switch off that spun shape 2, switch on spun shape 3, and just click in the white space here. So here we have a vector, and we can see this vector here, and you can see that we have two areas on the vector that are going to represent recesses in the component that we create. So let's take that vector, we're going to spin that around the left endpoint, and then we're going to go ahead and press apply. And so there we have our spun shape with this negative detail. Now if we just take a look at that, I'll just turn it on its side, look up the y-axis, and we can actually see that the shape we've got is actually sat underneath the modelling plane. So let's just put that in Z, and if I hover my cursor over these flat areas, you'll see highlighted at the bottom that we actually have a Z value of 0. There's actually no height here. And that's because the cross section that we're using is actually a flat horizontal line with just these negative areas, so it doesn't have any height in the actual cross section itself. It only has negative height, which we can see at those peaks there. So if we just close that down, we could probably better see this if we added in a zero plane. So a zero plane is a plane that we add to fill the job space. It's just a component that has a height of 0. So when we add that in, we can see how our part actually looks. So we've just got these grooves running round in a circle, this point here and this point here. Now this may actually be the part that I intended to create. However, if I wanted this to be a raised shape, I must remember to include legs on my cross section to give that cross section some height. So let's just take both of those components by holding down Shift and selecting them in the component tree, right click and use the option here to delete them. So now I'm going to take this vector and I'm going to select it again to put it into transform mode. I'm going to use the transform shortcut keys here to move this up exactly by ½ inch. I'm just going to take the end point so you can see I'm snapped to that point there. Just going to use my left mouse button, hold that down, drag that up. And whilst this is held down, I'm going to type in 0.5, you can see that at the bottom there, and then just press enter to apply that, and that will move that up the y-axis by ½ inch. So then we're going to come into the drawing tab, I'm going to use the polyline tool, I'm going to snap to the end point of that cross section there. I'm going to come down by ½ inch. You'll see that I'm actually snapping to the centre of my job there. So I can click and then press space just to temporarily come out of the polyline tool there. And then we're going to snap to that point on the end there, click in place and then pull that down to that horizontal line. We can see we've got a length there of ½ inch. I can click and then right click to come out there, and now I have 3 separate vectors that need joining. So I'm going to select one, shift and select the other 2, and then we're going to come over, use the join open vectors tool. At this tolerance we're going to have one open vector after we've joined them, so let's use the option to join, close that down. You'll see now that I have a vector here that we're now ready to spin. So with that vector selected, let's go into the modelling tab, into the turn and spin tool, use the spin option and then go ahead and press apply. And so now if we take a look at that shape, we can see it's now above the modelling plane. We now have a positive shape, and if we put that in Z and just travel the cursor across those flat areas, we can see we have a Z height of 0.5. That's the height of the legs that we input on that cross section. And so that really concludes this tutorial on how to use the turn and spin tool in the software.